The Grayson family meetings were never really about family. They were polished affairs dressed up as tradition leather couches, catered lunches, forced laughter, and just enough passive aggression to keep everyone on edge. That Saturday, the sun streamed through the cathedral windows of my father's house as if it didn't know better. I sat on the edge of the armchair like it was temporary, like I could still leave without consequence. Travis, my older brother, made his entrance loud and late, wearing a jacket worth more than my rent. He clapped my father on the back like they were equals in a boardroom and gave our Aunt Patricia a kiss on the cheek. Then he saw me. Well, well, he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Didn't expect to see you here. Elena, thought you'd be too busy, building your fortune. A few light chuckles fluttered around the room like moths. I didn't answer. There was nothing new to say. I'd heard all the jabs before. But this time, he didn't stop there. No, seriously, he continued, walking to the drinks cart. Word is, our dear Elena's savings just hit a milestone. Triple digits. Right. He poured himself a whiskey, even though it was barely noon. Then he turned and lifted his glass toward me. To our sister, he said, the proud owner of 100 actual dollars. The room erupted. Not with belly laughter. No. It was worse, those tight, polite laughs that wrap around your throat like a tie you can't loosen. My father smirked behind his tumbler. My aunt made a noise between a cough and a giggle. My cousin Maria raised her eyebrows in mock admiration. I felt the heat rising in my chest, up my neck, all the way to my ears, but I didn't flinch. Yes, I said simply, it's 100 more than I had last month. That quieted them for a second. Not out of respect, more like confusion. They didn't know what to do with calm defiance. Mr. Dalton, our family lawyer, sat patiently in the corner with his briefcase on his lap, waiting for the theatrics to settle. He was older now, his hair thinner, his glasses fogged from the warmth of the room, but his expression was unreadable. As always. Finally. My father cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. I won't waste everyone's time, he said. We're here to go over the final asset allocations Harold left behind. Nothing complicated. Harold Grayson, my grandfather. He'd passed 3 months ago, quietly, in his sleep. There'd been no grand funeral, just a private ceremony by the river he used to fish. My parents had said he left behind very little and that it was best to focus on the future. I hadn't asked questions. I didn't think there were answers. Mr. Dalton opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder, thick, sealed, cream-colored with red wax. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began. As executor of Mr. Harold Grayson's personal affairs, he said, I am to distribute a number of final items, per his instructions. Most of these are symbolic. Mementos. He called names. An old wristwatch for my Uncle George, a set of fishing rods for Travis, a detail that made him puff up with pride. Then Mr. Dalton looked at me. Elena Grayson. My name sat awkwardly in the air, like it didn't belong. Travis raised an eyebrow. Mr. Dalton continued, pulling something from the folder. You are to receive this envelope and instructions to read it in private. There was a pause, just long enough for Travis to scoff. That's it. No painting, no pocket knife, not even a book. Just a letter. Maria added, frowning. But I wasn't listening. My eyes were fixed on the envelope now resting on the table in front of me. Thick parchment. Wax seal with the Grayson family crest, the old oak tree surrounded by stars. My grandfather's symbol, his words, locked away. Travis leaned over. Maybe it's a loan request. I looked at him, calm. Maybe it's a map, I said. And you're not on it. His smirk faltered just briefly. I reached for the envelope with both hands. It was heavier than I expected. Solid, intentional. I didn't open it. Not yet. Not there. Not in that room. Mr. Dalton stood. That concludes the allocations. I'll remain available for follow-ups as needed. Thank you all. Chairs scraped, conversations resumed, drinks refilled, but I held the envelope tight. Elena, my father said as I passed, don't get your hopes up. I didn't reply. Not because I was scared, but because, for the first time in a long time, I was curious about the man they barely spoke of anymore, about the part of him they hadn't buried. I stepped outside, into the cold sunlight, the envelope warm in my coat. Somewhere between shame and something else entirely, a glimmer. A pull. Not everything valuable rattles in a vault. Some things arrive quietly, sealed in wax. Waiting, I waited until I was home to open it. My apartment wasn't much a third-floor walk-up with creaky floors and a front door that needed a special jiggle to lock. But it was mine. The radiator hissed like it had secrets, and the light filtered in through pale curtains that fluttered in the draft. I sat on the edge of my bed, the envelope on my lap like it might bite. I took a breath and broke the seal. The first thing I saw was a key, brass, worn, cool in my palm. It dangled from a thin piece of red string knotted into a loop. Then the letter. It was handwritten in my grandfather's looping. Careful script, not typed, not dictated, just ink, paper, and intention. My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, then the others have already laughed. Let them, that's part of the plan. I blinked, reread the line. You don't know the whole story because I never told it. And the rest of them never asked. But I watched you. I saw the way you tried to build something real while everyone else chased reflections. That took more courage than they'll ever understand. This key is to the apartment above the old Grayson bookshop, the one on Willow Street. I kept it locked after your grandmother passed. Nobody cared to ask what was up there. They all assumed it was just storage. Let them keep assuming. Inside, you'll find the part of me that never made it to the boardroom. My notebooks, my journals, my failures, my beginnings. Yours now. I've left instructions with Mr. Dalton for something else, something that only activates if you turn that key. You won't find gold or shares or land in that room, but you'll find the blueprint of something greater, and if you choose to follow it, I'll be with you every step of the way. If not, lock the door behind you. No shame in walking away, but I hope you don't. You were always the one who listened between the lines. H.G. The page trembled slightly in my hands. I wasn't sure if it was the letter or me. The old bookshop on Willow Street. I hadn't been there since I was 12. It had been Grandpa's world, full of leather-bound novels and dust motes that danced in sunbeams. I remember thinking it smelled like stories. They'd closed it after Grandma died, claiming no one read anymore. The building had sat quiet ever since. I looked down at the key in my hand. It was heavier now. I didn't wait. I grabbed my coat, shoved the letter into my bag, and left. The bookshop stood exactly as I remembered it, except older. The windows were grime-streaked and the faded gold lettering across the door had flaked away in places. A small rusted closed sign hung crookedly in the glass. The sidewalk was cracked. Weeds pushed up through the bricks like nature refused to forget. But the door opened without resistance. Inside, the air was thick with time. Dust blanketed every surface. Shelves still stood, tall and proud, though the books were mostly gone, moved or sold or claimed. A few remained, slouched like old friends waiting for someone to speak. I stepped carefully to the back, past the register that still had an old price tag sticking to it, and found the narrow staircase. It groaned as I climbed. At the top was a faded red door. No number. Just wood and memory. I pulled out the key, slid it into the lock. It clicked. The door opened inward with a soft sigh. What I saw stopped me cold. It wasn't a forgotten storage space. It was a time capsule. Sunlight spilled in from tall windows, illuminating a space that felt both abandoned and alive. A drafting table stood near the center, covered in blueprints, sketches, and photographs. Walls were lined with shelves not of books, but of boxes labeled with years, journals, notes, ideas. And in the center, on a simple wooden easel, was a frame, inside it, a single photograph. Me, 10 years old, kneeling in front of the shop with chalk on my hands, grinning at something just out of frame. I didn't even know that picture existed, but he had captured it, preserved it. There was a chair in the corner. I sat slowly, overwhelmed. The letter had said this wasn't about money, but I was beginning to understand it was about something older, deeper, a kind of inheritance that didn't show up on bank statements. He had seen me when no one else had. I stayed in that apartment for hours, flipping through notebooks filled with ramblings about community, innovation, failure, and hope. It was like watching someone's mind stretch in real time, an archive of what he couldn't be in public. One note stood out, scribbled at the bottom of a torn page. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you plant in someone else. A folder marked, for e.g., sat tucked under a pile of yellowing maps. I opened it. Inside a proposal, a foundation, a plan for a trust fund dormant, untouched, and a clause that gave control to an heir demonstrating resilience beyond profit. It was a skeleton incomplete, but intentional. I wasn't holding paper. I was holding a doorway, and all I had to do was choose to walk through. The apartment above the old bookshop became my second skin. I returned the next day, and the day after that. Within a week, I knew where the floor creaked near the windows, which shelf leaned slightly to the left, and where Grandpa had stashed chocolate in the back of an old filing cabinet still wrapped, though expired by a decade. It didn't matter. Nothing in that place had spoiled. I brought a small vacuum and a folding chair, replaced the light bulbs. A neighbor across the alley noticed the windows lit up at night and left a note under the door. "If the shop's reopening, we'll be your first customers." I didn't know how to answer that. It wasn't a shop anymore. It was a vault of vision. Grandpa had written constantly in margins, napkins, proper journals, the backs of invoices. I found lists of books he wanted to read, quotes he'd overheard, outlines for projects he'd never finished. But beneath all the ink and planning, there was one unshakable truth: he had wanted more for this family. And not in dollars. He had wanted freedom, imagination, integrity, things we'd lost chasing legacy. In one folder labeled Horizon, I found the draft for something called the Grayson Community Studio, a shared creative space for local artists and youth. It was an ambitious project, part gallery, part workshop, part mentorship hub. According to his notes, he'd tried to fund it quietly through the Grayson Trust, but had faced resistance from the board, mostly my father. Not revenue positive. One note quoted in angry red ink, "No brand alignment." So Grandpa shelved it, but he hadn't abandoned it. He'd just waited. And now, it was mine. I called Mr. Dalton. He answered on the second ring. "I was expecting your call," he said, voice as even as ever. "You knew what was in the apartment." I said, "I did. And the trust that, too." There was a pause. I could hear the shuffle of papers on his desk. "So what happens next?" I asked. "That depends on you." "Miss Grayson." He used my last name in full. And it startled me, not in a bad way. like being reminded of something I hadn't realized I'd forgotten. The documents your grandfather left are binding, he continued. If you choose to activate the transfer clause, control of the Grayson Community Fund, a subsidiary of the family trust, moves to you. That includes decision-making authority, financial oversight, and access to the dormant assets. How much is in it? Just under 4 million, untouched for nearly 20 years. My breath hitched. But, Dalton continued, if you activate it, the rest of the family will know. The clause was structured to be discreet only until triggered. After that, full disclosure is required by the trust charter. Of course. Nothing stayed hidden forever. And if I don't activate it, I asked. Then nothing changes. The trust remains dormant. You walk away. No one knows. No harm done. No legacy either. I whispered. There was another silence. This one softer. Your grandfather believed legacy wasn't what you leave behind. Dalton said. It's what you set in motion. I didn't sign anything that day. I walked instead through the old neighborhoods, past the school where I used to doodle in the margins of math worksheets, past the train station where Grandpa used to pick me up with a thermos of hot cocoa. The city looked different now, sharper, hungrier. But under the noise, I saw pockets of something else, a man sketching on a napkin outside a cafe, a child chalking superheroes on a sidewalk, a violinist playing near the crosswalk with a tin can full of nickels. These were the people Grandpa had wanted to reach. Not stockholders, not heirs, artists, dreamers, the almost forgotten. By the time I returned to the apartment, the sun had set. The whole room glowed golden, as if waiting. I picked up the folder labeled Horizon. I turned to the final page. It was blank, waiting for someone to write. The next morning, I went back to Mr. Dalton's office. His receptionist blinked in surprise when I walked in, probably expecting Travis or my father. I'm here to activate the clause, I said simply. 10 minutes later, I signed. It was quiet. No ceremony, just ink and paper. Afterward, Dalton handed me a smaller envelope. What's this? I asked. Another letter. He said, your grandfather prepared it for this moment. He didn't want to pressure you, but he had faith. I opened it in the hallway, hands slightly shaking. Dear Elena, so, you turned the key. You saw the dust, the drafts, the dreams. You made the choice. That makes you braver than I was when I first drew the blueprint. They won't understand at first. Maybe not ever. But that's not your burden to carry. What you're building isn't a rebuttal. It's a renewal. You're not here to argue with the past. You're here to imagine what comes after it. The money isn't the gift. Elena, you are. I folded the letter slowly, holding it against my chest. For the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar settling over me. Purpose. Not as a protest, but as a promise. The first thing I did with the money wasn't flashy. No champagne, no press release, no Instagram post. I bought time. I gave notice at my part-time cafe job. Not because I thought I was above it, but because I finally had the space to think without measuring it in shifts and tips. Then I got to work at the apartment, which, now that I knew its purpose, I couldn't keep calling the apartment. It wasn't just a space. It was a command center. I dusted, organized, cataloged. I turned one wall into a dry erase board mural sketches, quotes from Grandpa's journals, budget outlines. There were 2 maps pinned above the drafting table, one of the city, and one of the community zones that Grandpa had wanted to serve with the original Grayson Community Studio plan. Under them, I wrote one word in red marker, activate. I created a new folder on my laptop, Project Lightwell. A placeholder name, but it stuck. My first step was research. I spent weeks reaching out to grassroots arts collectives, nonprofit spaces, and independent creators. I learned what failed, what succeeded, and why. I met with organizers who looked at me with skepticism until I showed them the letter from Grandpa. Until I shared the original Horizon documents. One woman, Marta Chen, founder of a mobile arts van for underserved schools, stared at me across a diner booth and said, "Wait, so you're telling me the Graysons have had a dormant art fund sitting on ice for decades, and you just unlocked it like a cheat code?" "Basically," I said, "and you're not going to turn it into some rich people art-washing gala factory?" "No," I said, grinning. "But that would be a hell of a rebrand." She laughed, then sobered. "If you're serious, you've got people who need this. Kids who've never held a real camera. Teens who think creativity is a luxury." I was serious. And now I had names, neighborhoods, stories. This wasn't charity. It was investment in the overlooked. At the same time, the weight of silence began to grow. I hadn't told my family. Not yet. In their world, I was still the sibling who scraped by with $100 in savings and no concrete future, still the one they could mock over brunch without consequence. I let them. For now. Every text from my father asking if I'd applied for real work went unanswered. Every veiled jab from Travis on family group chats, screenshots of luxury condos and motivational quotes about hustling was ignored. But my silence wasn't passive. It was strategic. Because while they laughed, I was meeting with architects. While they drank at networking galas, I was combing through zoning permits. While they congratulated each other on Instagram, I was learning how to build something they didn't even know existed. Then came the call I hadn't expected. "Mr. Dalton, we've received an inquiry from the primary Grayson board." He said, "Travis has requested a full audit of all trust activity." My stomach tightened. "Can he do that?" "Yes. As a board member, he's entitled to review board-level financial flows. But not the community fund. That's been partitioned. Unless he learns the right legal phrasing, he won't know it exists." Yet, I echoed. Dalton paused. "They're suspicious. That's natural. They've always assumed power moves in straight lines. Yours didn't. Should I be worried?" "No," he said. "But be ready." I was. Weeks passed. Project Lightwell took form. I secured a lease on a warehouse in the Edgeview district, a neglected part of the city with abandoned storefronts and bright-eyed teenagers who didn't care about stock options. It wasn't pretty, but it had bones, high ceilings, skylights, history. We stripped it down to brick and steel and started rebuilding. I hired my first coordinator, a fiercely driven illustrator named Jasmine, who wore headphones 24/7 and had a tattoo of an open book on her neck. She asked no questions about where the money came from. "Only what we plan to do with it. The space will have to speak for itself," she said. "No marble plaques, no Grayson name in gold. This isn't about them." I nodded. It never was. Together, we drafted a mission to provide access, tools, and opportunity for creators pushed to the margins and to elevate voices that legacy forgot. It was bold, personal, clear. We printed it on the back wall in 5 languages. I didn't invite my family to the walkthrough. They wouldn't have seen what I saw anyway. One night, alone in the studio, I opened the last box from the bookshop apartment. Inside were a few black and white photographs, old, hand-developed. One showed my grandfather, young and lean, sitting on a bench with a camera slung across his shoulder. Another stunningly showed my mother, barefoot, dancing in a summer field, her laugh frozen in light. I'd never seen that side of her. The last photo was of me again, this time older, 16, holding a sketchbook at a park bench, unaware of the lens. He'd followed my journey long after I thought he stopped watching, and suddenly, I realized what all of this was. He hadn't just built a legacy, he'd built a lens, one I now held. The soft launch of Project Lightwell was quiet by design. No press, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just open doors and an invitation for the community to walk in. We printed a few flyers, posted to local artist boards, and spread the word through community centers. Jasmine coordinated with local schools and youth shelters. We stocked the studio with sketch pads, cameras, paints, refurbished laptops with editing software, and shelves of donated supplies. Everything was labeled, accessible, free. The first to arrive were unsure. A few teenagers hovered at the threshold like they'd stepped into the wrong place. "Is this for anyone?" one asked. "Yes," I said. "Especially you." They didn't say thank you. They just nodded, stepped inside, and began. Over the next few weeks, the space filled. A boy named Malcolm showed up every day after school to sketch designs for sneakers he wanted to make one day. A girl named Lila wrote poetry on our typewriter in the back until her fingers cramped. Two cousins painted a mural on the east wall, a collage of faces from the neighborhood, layered with color and defiance. It wasn't perfect, but it was working. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. And eventually, it did. A week into our first month, I received an email from a generic Grayson Holdings address. Subject: Urgent Financial Reconciliation Inquiry. Attached a PDF of recent transactions and a forwarded message chain with my name circled multiple times. Travis. Of course. He'd found traces of the fund. Or something close to it. The activation clause had likely triggered a line item he didn't recognize, and now he was sniffing around. I could almost hear him pacing in his office, furious that someone had moved a chess piece without his permission. 2 days later, I received a call from my father. "Your brother says there's been some irregular activity linked to an old family trust. Elena, is there something you need to tell us?" I was sitting in the gallery corner of the studio, watching Lila tape her latest poem to the wall. The piece was raw and beautiful, about a bus ride through her neighborhood and the sound of her mother's voice humming against the window. I took a breath. "No," I said, "there's nothing I need to tell you." There was a pause, a long, disbelieving silence. "You're being evasive." "No," I repeated, more calmly. "I'm just not obligated to explain things that don't involve you. I think you're making a mistake." "Maybe." But it was my mistake to make. That Friday, Travis showed up at the studio. He didn't announce it, he never did. He walked in like he owned the place, eyes scanning the walls, the art, the people. He was wearing a blazer too sharp for the room, and a smirk that didn't belong. "Elena," he said, "impressive little project." "It's not little," I replied. He glanced at the ceiling. "You've been busy." With what money? I folded my arms. "That's not your concern." His smile tightened. "It is if it came from Grayson funds." "It didn't." I said, "Technically true. The fund was created from Grandpa's assets but partitioned outside the main trust structure. Legally mine. Ethically too. If such a thing counted in Travis's world. This isn't a charity fair." "Elena," he said, "you can't just play philanthropist and expect no questions." "I'm not playing anything." I said, "You're the one pretending to care." He stepped closer, voice low. "You don't belong in this world. You think because you've read a few books about impact investment and painted some walls, you understand legacy. I understand enough to know it shouldn't be weaponized." He blinked. That hit something. Then he leaned in, all venom. "Sooner or later, someone's going to ask the right question. Elena, you can't hide forever." "I'm not hiding," I said. "I'm building." "There's a difference." He left without saying goodbye. Jasmine came over 10 minutes later. He your brother. Unfortunately. She raised an eyebrow. He looks like someone who'd sue a soup kitchen. I laughed harder than I had in weeks. That night, I sat in the apartment above the old bookstore, now my haven, and reread Grandpa's original Horizon documents. Tucked inside was another note I hadn't noticed before. Elena, you may face resistance. They'll call it tradition, call it order, but mostly, they'll be scared of losing what they didn't earn. Let them. You were never meant to inherit a boardroom. You were meant to light a room no one else thought to enter. The next day, I framed the note and hung it above the front door of the studio. Below it, in smaller print, legacy is not what you keep, it's what you pass forward. Weeks passed, then a month, then 2. We hosted our first showcase, a modest evening with local guests, tea and paper cups, and walls lined with student work. There were no reporters, no donors, no trustees, but there was joy. There were tears. Lila read her poem to a hushed room, and someone's grandmother clapped so hard her bracelet flew off. Malcolm sold his first print, a hand-inked design of a shoe inspired by street cracks and subway tiles. One of the muralists got accepted into an arts program he never thought he'd qualify for. I stood in the corner, invisible and full. The legacy they tried to measure in market value was blooming here. Right in front of me, in brush strokes and verse and colored light, they couldn't see it. Not yet. But they would. The confrontation I'd been avoiding came on a Sunday. In the middle of a brunch I hadn't agreed to. My mother texted me the day before family brunch. Tomorrow at 11. Your father insists. No location. No invitation. No question mark. It was at the Grayson estate. Of course, the house where portraits outnumbered people. And the dining room had more place settings than warmth. I showed up out of curiosity, not obligation. I wanted to see how much they knew. How much they thought they knew. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the shift in air pressure, that invisible force of family power dynamics, where silence could say more than shouting. Travis was already seated, sipping espresso like he'd been waiting hours. My father stood at the window, pretending to look outside, and my mother arranged cutlery with surgical precision. Everyone had a role. I didn't sit. Before we eat, my father said, still staring at the garden hedges, I think we should clear the air. Ah, the air. As if this were just a misunderstanding over a missed phone call. Travis didn't wait. He leaned forward, voice cool and precise. You've been misusing a legacy asset. The community fund is part of Grayson Holdings' umbrella structure. You're not authorized to. I am. I interrupted. He blinked. My mother set down her fork. Excuse me, my father said. Finally turning from the window, I pulled out the folder I'd brought, the one with Grandpa's signed documents, the legal validation from Mr. Dalton, and a notarized statement confirming my sole stewardship of the fund. I placed it on the table like a mirror. This isn't your decision, I said. It never was. Travis snatched the folder, flipping through it furiously. This is a loophole, he muttered. He exploited a clause. He wrote the clause, I corrected. He created it for this, for me. My mother spoke next, voice sharp and quiet. Why wouldn't you tell us? I looked at her. Really looked. She hadn't aged much physically, but there was a tightness around her eyes I didn't remember. A tension that wasn't about business or legacy, it was about control. Because you never asked. I said, you never even considered that I might be entrusted with anything real. We raised you, my father snapped. We gave you everything. You gave me comparisons. I said. You gave Travis applause and gave me silence. He stood straighter. So this is revenge? No. I said, calmly. This is independence. My brother tossed the folder back onto the table. You don't understand the scale of what you're playing with. Do you know how fragile family reputation is? Yes, I said, because I've lived on the other side of it. I stepped back, ready to leave. This was never about the money. I added, this was about value, and you never saw mine until it threatened yours. I turned toward the door. My mother stood abruptly. Elena, wait. I paused but didn't look back. You're still part of this family, she said. Not quite pleading, not quite commanding. I smiled not cruelly, just with clarity. I never stopped being part of the family. I said, the family stopped being part of me. Then I walked out. The next morning, an article went live. Not one written by me, but by a local journalist who had attended our second community showcase. The title was simple: The Other Grayson Legacy Art, Access, and the Quiet Rise of Project Lightwell. It wasn't scandalous. It didn't name-drop my family. It focused on the space, the mission, the work. There were photos of the studio, quotes from students, and a closing paragraph that made me sit down when I read it. Sometimes the most powerful inheritance isn't wealth, it's belief, and Elena Grayson is passing it on, frame by frame. My phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from old classmates, strangers, journalists, former teachers, and then from my mother, no words, just the article link, seen. I didn't respond. Instead, I spent the day helping hang a new installation at the studio, a series of photo essays taken by first-time teenage photographers who had documented a day in the life from their own neighborhoods. Shots of cracked pavement, steam rising from manholes, worn sneakers on front stoops, mirrored windows reflecting hope and exhaustion in equal measure. Each image told a story my family never would have noticed. Each one was a counter-narrative to what the Graysons had chosen to define as legacy. In one frame, I saw a boy sitting on the hood of a car, sunlight glinting off his face, lost in thought. It wasn't a technically perfect photo, but it was honest, and it made my throat tighten, because I recognized that look. It was the same one I had the night I opened Grandpa's envelope, the look of someone who just realized they might matter. That night, I walked back to the bookshop apartment. The key still lived on a red string around my neck. I unlocked the door, flicked on the light, and stood in the same spot where I'd found Grandpa's first letter. But now the room looked different. It wasn't just filled with his past. It was filled with my future. I opened a new journal. First page. Blank. At the top, I wrote, "What do you build when no one's watching?" Then I wrote the answer. Everything that matters. The invitations went out 6 weeks later. Heavy cream cardstock. Debossed lettering. Minimalist. Elegant. Impossible to ignore. The kind of envelope that made you curious before you even opened it. The return address was listed simply as Lightwell Studio, Willow Street, Edgeview District. Each invitation was accompanied by a personal note. Handwritten in black ink, "You are invited to the inaugural gallery night at Lightwell Studio." Origins. A collection of stories captured in image and light, curated by Elena Grayson. I sent them to local artists, donors, journalists, educators, and yes, my family. Each name written with the same careful hand. No distinction, no hierarchy. Travis's was sent certified. I imagined the look on his face when he saw it. Jasmine raised her eyebrows when she saw the guest list. "We're going that public," I nodded. "Let them see." "You sure?" she asked. "You really want them all in the same room?" "No," I said. "But it's time." For weeks, we had been preparing. The studio was transformed. We cleared the workshop areas and converted the open space into a gallery path, black matte walls, clean lighting. Every image mounted with precision. The students' work came first raw, vibrant, and fiercely honest. Then the collaborative mural project, with photos integrated into paint strokes, telling the story of community seen from dozens of different angles. And finally, the last room. The surprise, my collection, curated for the first time. Personal pieces I had kept in drawers or shown only in coffee shops and local fairs. Photos from my childhood neighborhood, from the years I'd spent invisible, from corners of the city my family had driven past without noticing. And in the center of that final room, mounted behind museum glass, was the photograph of my grandfather. Young, holding a camera, looking straight into the lens. Beside it, another piece, the red wax-sealed envelope he'd left me. Flattened, preserved, framed. And next to that, the photo of the $100 bill I'd kept taped to my fridge for years, crumpled, but intact with a handwritten caption underneath. The moment they laughed. The moment I began. The night of the event. The studio buzzed with light and anticipation. The first guests arrived, early local teachers, city art program coordinators, friends of the students. They walked slowly through the rooms, murmuring to one another, pausing often. Some took photos, some cried. Jasmine greeted each guest with practiced warmth, her clipboard in hand like a shield. I stayed mostly in the background, watching, absorbing. Then, an hour into the event, they arrived. My mother first, her heels clicking like a metronome of disapproval. She wore navy silk and pearls, understated and expensive. My father followed tailored, tense. Travis walked in last, alone, dressed like he was attending a tech launch party. His eyes swept the space with calculation. For a moment, they stood at the entrance, unsure. This wasn't their world. They didn't know how to own it. Perfect. I didn't greet them. I let them wander. They walked through the room slowly, reading the artist's statements, staring at the images. Occasionally, one would lean toward the other to whisper. My mother lingered the longest in the student section. My father skimmed. Travis barely looked at anything until he stepped into the final room. He froze when he saw the envelope, and then the bill. His face didn't change, not entirely, but I saw it. The recognition, the discomfort, the realization that the joke he'd made that day had become immortalized, framed, reclaimed. He turned to me across the room. "This was your plan all along," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "This was my life. I just stopped hiding it." My mother stepped beside him. "You made us look cruel. You were cruel," I said gently. "You just didn't expect anyone to hold up a mirror." My father, to his credit, said nothing. He just stared at the photograph of Grandpa, then at me. And I thought for a second I saw something flicker, not regret, not quite. Maybe the awareness that he no longer held the power to define me. Jasmine appeared at my side. "Press is asking for a statement." "Later," I whispered. "Give them the art first." Later that evening, I gave a short speech. I stood beside the photo of Grandpa, my palms flat against the wood of the lectern. "This studio exists because someone believed in stories that weren't being told," I said. "Because someone saw value where others saw failure. Because someone left behind more than wealth, he left behind a door." I paused, looked at the crowd, and I walked through it. There was applause. Not thunderous, not performative, real. Afterward, a young girl, maybe 12, tugged at my sleeve. I liked the picture of the broken fence. She said, "It was sad and pretty at the same time." I smiled. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd feel." "Can I take pictures like that?" "You already can," I said. "You just have to start." My family left without saying goodbye. I watched them walk out, shadows long behind them, and I felt nothing but relief. They had finally seen the truth, not just about me, but about the world they'd ignored for too long. And whether they chose to face it or not, it had been documented, displayed, visible, unavoidable. The next morning, the studio was quiet. Empty cups still sat on counters. Stray programs lay folded on benches. Light from the tall windows cut across the floor, warm and silent, illuminating the aftermath of the night before, but not in a ruinous way, more like the gentle breath that follows a deep exhale. I walked through each room, alone. The photos remained on the walls, but somehow they looked different, fuller, as though now that people had seen them, really seen them, they had grown roots. In the final room, I stood in front of the photograph of my grandfather again. His eyes looked forward, camera slung across his chest, expression neutral. But I could feel what he had felt, the quiet conviction of someone choosing to make instead of mimic, of someone walking alone, not because no one would follow, but because no one else would start. I wasn't alone anymore, but I was still leading. Behind me, someone cleared their throat. Travis. He stood in the doorway of the gallery's final room, hands in his coat pockets, eyes less sharp than usual. He stepped inside and closed the distance without speaking. For a few moments, neither of us said anything. The air between us was thick with unspoken history, years of division, superiority, resentment. Then he said it. "You embarrassed us." I turned to him. "No, I exposed you." He let out a sharp exhale. "Same thing. It's not. Embarrassment is temporary. Exposure makes you choose who to be next." He looked at the framed envelope, then the caption beneath the $100 photograph. "That day." He started, then hesitated. "I didn't think it mattered. You always acted like you were above it all." "No," I said. "I just stopped pretending it didn't hurt." He glanced around the room again. "This place, it's real." That was the point. "And the money? It was all from the fund Grandpa set aside." I nodded. "Legally, ethically, completely mine to manage." He ran a hand through his hair. "I've been in meetings for years, actual boardrooms, thinking I had control. And it turns out, the most valuable asset in the entire family wasn't even on my radar. It wasn't an asset." I said, "It was a vision, and that's why you didn't see it." He let that sit. Then finally, "What are you going to do with all of this?" "Keep building," I said. "Keep giving. Keep letting people create without asking for permission." He paused. "You're not even angry." "Oh, I was." I admitted. "I wanted to shame you all. Drag this across headlines. Turn the $10 mockery into a banner. But then I realized that's what you'd do. Not me." He looked down. "So this was the high road?" "No. This was my road. You just never saw it." He nodded slowly. There was no apology, but something like recognition shimmered faintly in his silence. "I don't expect anything from you, Travis," I said. "Not support, not understanding. But I do expect you to stop standing in the way." He looked me in the eye for a long time. "Then I guess we're done competing." "We were never competing," I said. "You just never noticed I wasn't even in the race." He gave a small, tight laugh. Touché. He left a moment later, no handshake, no hug, just a nod. But I didn't need closure. I'd already built something stronger. Later that week, my mother reached out again. This time it was an email. Short, formal, subject impressive. Elena, the work is beautiful. I see now what I didn't before. I hope you continue to thrive. Mom. There was no love, no warmth, but it was something. A sliver of humanity. A rare admission. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded it to Jasmine with a single line. They're watching now. Her response came back instantly. Let them. We're not stopping. A few days later, I hosted an open workshop. No gallery, no speech, just folding tables, buckets of brushes, piles of paper and canvases. I invited every local school that had ever said, "We don't have funding for art." I invited shelter programs, youth centers, parents who homeschooled. I told them, come create, by 2 p.m. The studio was overflowing. Paint smears on jeans, laughter bouncing off the walls, stories in color, in charcoal, in bursts of marker ink. One little boy, maybe 7, came up to me with a splattered handprint on cardboard. I made it for you, he said. I crouched to meet his eyes. Tell me about it. It's my hand, he said, proudly. So you don't forget we were here. I almost cried. Because that's what this was. Not legacy on paper, but presence. Proof of impact. Proof that someone mattered. That night, I locked up the studio and walked to the apartment above the old bookshop. I poured tea in the chipped mug Grandpa had left behind and curled up in the armchair by the window. Outside, the street lights flickered, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves. I took out my notebook, the same one I'd started the day I activated the fund. I flipped to a blank page. At the top, I wrote, "What does it mean to inherit a future?" And then, slowly, I began to answer it. 1 month after the gallery night, a letter arrived at the studio, thick parchment, no return address, sealed with wax red, like the one Grandpa used. At first, I thought it might be something ceremonial, maybe an old document Mr. Dalton forgot to pass along. But when I opened it, the handwriting told me everything. It wasn't Grandpa's. It was my father's. The script was neater than I expected, measured, almost careful. Elena, I've delayed writing this, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had too much ego, too much confusion. I was raised to believe control was love, that success was currency, that legacy could only pass through a nameplate. But I saw what you built. And it shook something loose. I won't pretend to understand it, but I do see it. And maybe that's a start. You've done something I couldn't, not just with money with meaning. If you're willing, I'd like to talk. Not as your father, as a man learning how to listen. R.G. I folded the letter slowly and placed it on my desk. I didn't cry, but I did feel the shift. It was like hearing a song in a different key, familiar, but unexpected. Maybe it wasn't reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement. And that was more than I'd ever hoped for. 2 days later, I invited him to the studio, not privately, not in secret. I scheduled a visit during our open residency review when the studio would be alive, moving, loud with energy and art. If he wanted to see what I was building, he would see all of it. He arrived in a charcoal coat, holding an umbrella he didn't need. His eyes scanned the space as if it were a foreign country. Students bustled around him, pinning sketches to critique boards. Jasmine directed traffic near the 3D printer. Someone was tuning a guitar in the sound lab we'd just opened. He stood stiffly until I waved him toward me. "Thank you for coming," I said. "I wasn't sure if you'd answer," he replied, voice lower than usual. "I wasn't sure if you'd mean it," I said. He took a deep breath, looked around. "This place? It's a machine," he said. "But it breathes." That surprised me. I raised an eyebrow. "You've been reading art magazines." He smirked faintly. "Just your press." I led him through the studio. He said little, asked a few quiet questions. I watched him linger by the student exhibit wall, tracing his fingers along a plaque that read, "Created by artists aged 10 to 18 from Edgeview's Creative Outreach Program." We ended the tour in the central atrium, near the open seating area where the mural extended across the ceiling, a kaleidoscope of movement, memory, and possibility. He looked up for a long time. Then, finally, he said, "Your grandfather would have been proud." I turned to him. He was proud, long before any of this. My father nodded slowly. "I see that now." We sat in silence for a moment, not tense, just full. Then he asked, "Why didn't you fight harder to be seen?" "I did." I said, "You just weren't looking." That landed hard. He looked down at his hands. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "No," I replied. "You were protecting your version of me. The one who didn't threaten the blueprint." He didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It was one of Grandpa and me, sitting on the steps of the bookshop, eating ice cream, my legs swinging off the side. "I found this," he said, "in one of his old boxes. I thought you should have it." I took the photo carefully, feeling the edges, the weight of time captured in gloss. "I remember that day," I said. He let me pick the book he read out loud. "I picked a fairy tale. He told me later that you didn't want the prince to save anyone." My father said, with a small smile, "You wanted the princess to build her own ladder." I smiled. "Sounds about right." We sat there for a while longer. Not quite father and daughter, but maybe finally two people starting over. Before he left, he looked back once at the studio. "Let me know," he said, "if you ever want us involved, as supporters, quiet ones." I didn't promise anything, but I didn't say no. That night, I told Jasmine what had happened. She blinked, then said, "Are we letting the Empire in now?" "Maybe," I said, "but only if they use the side entrance." She laughed and raised her cup of ginger tea. "To building bridges with landmines underneath." I raised mine. "To walking anyway." In the weeks that followed, we expanded our programs. We opened a mobile Lightwell unit, a van converted into a traveling art studio, visiting underserved schools and neighborhoods. We added a mentorship program, pairing young creators with established artists. The waiting list tripled. I started receiving messages from strangers. A woman in Arizona who said her daughter found confidence again through photography. A retired teacher in Maine who asked if she could replicate the Lightwell model in her small town. A teenage sculptor in Detroit who said, "I didn't know I could matter like this." I printed that last line and taped it to my desk, because that's what it was always about. Not just art, but meaning. One morning, as I unlocked the apartment above the bookshop, I saw an envelope waiting by the door. No name, no seal, just a note, written in bold, careful print. "You redefine the map. Now teach others to draw, inside a check, anonymous, generous," with a handwritten postscript. "From someone who thought they understood legacy, until they saw yours." On the 1-year anniversary of Grandpa's passing, the city gave us rain, not a dramatic storm, but a steady, contemplative drizzle, the kind that softened the edges of the buildings and made puddles out of sidewalks. It felt appropriate, melancholy without being tragic. I arrived at the studio just after dawn. The sky was still gray, and the streets were quiet. A few students were already waiting outside, huddled under the awning, chatting softly. One held a portfolio wrapped in plastic. Another had a bouquet of paper flowers she'd made by hand. Inside, Jasmine had already lit the wall sconces and turned on the overhead gallery lights, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. She handed me a thermos of tea without a word and nodded toward the center of the main room. There, on a pedestal, was the new installation we'd spent weeks preparing, the legacy room. It wasn't flashy, no gold, no polished steel, just wood, canvas, film, and paper. A rotating archive of creative works paired with the stories behind them, who made them, why they mattered, what they overcame to exist. At the heart of the exhibit was a single piece that never rotated, the $100 photograph, crumpled, backlit, with the caption, "The moment they laughed, the moment I began." Next to it, a display case containing the red wax-sealed envelope, the key Grandpa gave me, and the original journal entry I wrote the night I found them. It read, "What do you build when no one's watching? Everything that matters." Later that day, Mr. Dalton arrived. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe just smaller without the looming weight of my family's legal dominion behind him. He greeted me quietly and handed me one final letter. This came into my care with very specific instructions. He said, to be delivered precisely 1 year after his passing. No sooner. I took the letter carefully. The envelope was unsealed. I opened it and began to read. "Elena, if you've made it this far, then you understand now what most never do. True wealth isn't protection, it's potential. I didn't leave you power to shield you. I left it to challenge you, to give you something sharp and strange and uncomfortable, something alive. You chose vision over vengeance. That's the kind of air the world needs. Keep going. Keep shaping light from silence. And when they ask you who you are, look them in the eye and say, I was trusted with a key. You were always the legacy. Elena, you just had to believe it first, with pride beyond words. H.G." I folded the letter slowly, pressing it to my chest. The room spun just slightly, not from dizziness, but from the weight of something sacred settling in. I turned to Mr. Dalton. "Would you like to see the legacy room?" He smiled. "More than anything." That evening, we lit a single candle in the front window of the studio. No announcement, no ceremony, just light. A tradition we'd created to mark the passing of time and people. Students passed by, tapping the glass gently. Alumni sent photos of candles they'd lit at home, across the city, across the country. A 13-year-old from Edgeview named Damien left a note at the front desk. "Thank you for making me feel real." Jasmine found it first. She didn't say anything, just handed it to me with the same reverence she used for old camera lenses. I read it twice. Then I added it to the legacy room under a new heading, Letters That Matter. Later that week, I walked through the bookshop apartment for the 1,000th time. It had changed, too. Where once it was a relic, now it was an archive. Shelves of journals, binders of grant proposals, framed letters, sketches from the first workshop students. A photograph of the first day the mobile unit went out, a van surrounded by laughing children holding paint-splattered brushes. I stood at the window, barefoot, the key still on its red string around my neck. Below, the city moved slow, deliberate. tired, and beautiful. I pulled out my notebook, the same one from the beginning, and turned to the last blank page. I wrote, "A legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what grows in the quiet after you're gone." Then I signed it. Elena Grayson, heir by choice, not design. Years from now, someone will walk into the studio and not know the story behind the key in the display case. They won't know who Travis was. They won't understand the meaning of the envelope or why a photograph of a crumpled bill makes people stop and stare. But that's okay. They don't need to. Because the story will already be in the walls, in the paint, in the poems. In the eyes of the next girl who walks in with nothing but an idea and the stubborn belief that she's allowed to matter. She'll ask, "Can I create here?" And someone, maybe Jasmine, maybe me, maybe one of the dozens who came through our doors will answer, "Yes," especially you. Because we've seen what happens when laughter tries to bury a seed. It grows. It always grows.